Defending your research. This video will have three main sections. A quick introduction. I really want to talk about what a PhD dissertation is and what its purpose, and what the committee has to consider in order for you to get a PhD. With that, everything that goes in your dissertation document and your defense presentation will make a lot more sense. So let's get into that. Introduction. The dissertation is a complete summary of your research. It's going to have all the background, the significance and novelty, the methods that you've developed to do your research, the research itself, your results, a discussion of those results, and also a little section on what may come next if you were to keep going in this area, future work. And if nothing else, the purpose of the dissertation is to justify to your committee that you deserve a PhD, but it's also there for the world to read and to disseminate your research. So let's think about what the committee has to ensure before they sign for your degree. The first thing is the topic and problem or hypothesis. I teach in engineering, so a lot of times it's a problem statement instead of a hypothesis. But is your problem statement or hypothesis well defined and stated? In other words, is it clear what you're doing? Is the research you've done new and novel enough? If it's not new, if it's been done before, it's not worthy of a PhD. Your job as a PhD is to generate new knowledge. Is the research significant enough to be worthy of a PhD? Is the research difficult enough? In your proposal, you outline some metrics for success. Hopefully, were those metrics satisfied? And then the last thing, was your research sufficiently disseminated? Did you publish? Did you create posters? Did you attend conferences? So the committee's thinking about all of these things, and they're looking at your dissertation document and your presentation and trying to decide if they can check off all of these. So with those in mind, write your dissertation. The dissertation document. Here's an outline of what goes inside your dissertation. And there is lots of flexibility in this. It's just after reading a whole bunch and seeing a whole bunch, they all seem to fall into this same order of topics. So the first thing is an introduction chapter, and this is where you state your problem statement or your hypothesis. You talk about why that's new and novel. You summarize your research, and you might even outline your document. Like, hey, in chapter 2, we talk about this. In chapter 3, we talk about that, and maybe justify why you're putting things in that order. You're definitely not going through details of anything. This should be a very brief chapter. The next thing, and this is optional, just depending if they're needed or not, is a bunch of background chapters. Think to yourself, what will a reader need to understand in order to understand my research? And you want to provide sufficient detail there so that readers can go on and understand your research. I think that can also serve to your committee to help establish you as an expert if you can sufficiently explain a lot of these background things. Now, if something is super well known, well, maybe just summarize it and cite where to get the information other places. If it's not so well covered, maybe not entirely new, go ahead and throw out the details here. From there, you want to go into your methods chapters. And so it's not directly the result you were getting, but did you have to come up with some kind of tool, some kind of algorithm, some kind of procedure that you would then do to get the results that were part of your research? So in which case, include that. So you might, if you wrote some new algorithm, you're going to have a chapter describing that algorithm. If you custom configured a piece of equipment, you may have a chapter on how you custom configure that. So it's not necessarily a bullseye on your research. It's the tools and methods that maybe aren't existing anywhere else that you have to describe in your dissertation. From there, you'll get into your actual research chapters, and here you're describing how you use those methods, the results you got. And very often your research chapters are copy and paste from publications. Just be cautious of any kind of copyright restrictions, because once you publish in a journal, they technically own that. They don't want to see that anywhere else. Now, where you place discussion of those results changes depending who you're talking to, and you can talk to your advisor about this. I tend to prefer the discussion to happen in the research chapter. So you'll lay out your research, what you've done, the results you got, and then you'll discuss why those are meaningful, what you learned, and all the profound conclusions that you draw. But some people, instead, for the conclusion chapter, they'll call it discussion and conclusion, and they'll move all the discussion there. I think that's perfectly fine. So go ahead and do that if that's the way you'd like. But in your conclusion, this may be one of the more important chapters here, but you definitely want to articulate what is significant and novel about your research. You're going to summarize the research that you've done, the results that you got, why those are important and what you got out of that, what new knowledge you created from that. You want to summarize the metrics that you probably outlined in your proposal, how you would measure your success, and talk about those metrics. What did you achieve and how you met them? So this is where you're discussing all the meaning and impact of your research at a high level, maybe not research result per result. That could happen in your research chapters, but at a high level, what's the meaning and impact of your research? And then I typically like to end this with a brief discussion of what type of future work could be done. So if somebody were to pick up where you left off, what are some hints about where they could go or how they would start doing that? Now, another question that comes up a lot, appendices. Should you have appendices? Appendices are completely optional, and there may be reasons you move stuff there. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but completely optional. You're never required to have an appendix, but go ahead and do that. Some things to remember when you're writing your dissertation. Anytime you write anything, you're telling a story. And so you want to hold the reader's hand and step them incredibly methodically through all aspects of your research. You want to start simple. Start at a high level and describe what you've done. Then go ahead and start filling in details. You don't want to go to the details and then jump to the high level, or just do only the details, assuming that the high level stuff would be obvious. So start at a high level and slowly start filling in details and work down as you go on your dissertation. Probably more just general rules for writing, but I see it a lot in dissertations that I review, but don't ever let your equations and figures do all the talking for you. You want to explain absolutely everything. And I have an example on a following slide of something bad but typical that I see. And every figure and every equation, you definitely want to cite from the text and then describe it. You know, pretend the person, for whatever reason, doesn't have access to the figure. At least have enough description of it that they don't need to see your figure. And I think that's a pretty good metric of how to write your dissertation. So here's an example. I see this all the time in publications and dissertations. Somebody might say, the finite difference method was used, see figure 7 for a summary. And they're basically leaving this figure to do all of the talking for them. And that is definitely not what should be done. Instead, this should be done. This is a complete detailed description of what you did using this finite difference method. Now, maybe the finite difference method is really well known, and you're going to cite this somewhere. Go see these references for a complete description of the finite difference method, but here's what I did with the finite difference method, and you talk through them in detail. So don't ever let the figures or equations do the talking for you. You do the talking and just back it up with a figure or equation. All right, more on the appendices. As I mentioned before, this is completely optional, but what are some reasons that you might want to use? Well, maybe you're telling a story somewhere in your dissertation, and along comes a mathematical derivation that goes on for many pages. If you insert that in the middle of your story, it could be very distracting. So instead, you can say, you know, starting at this equation, see Appendix A to get this new equation, and then you go on with your story. and you leave that derivation for the appendix. So that's one very good use for it. If there's something long and ugly that distracts from the story, but still needs to go with the story, an appendix is a great place to do that. You just might want to remember something for the future. So extra information that you did that just didn't end up anywhere else, doesn't seem to really fit in your dissertation, but it's some research that you did or an algorithm you developed, go ahead and stick that in an appendix. I've done things in my dissertation. I did a little picture of a hexagon and different dimensions of it, and it was super simple. And it was something that you could come up with if you drew a hexagon on paper, just a little bit of geometry, but it was just a picture that I wanted to have, and I put that in my appendix, and that was completely selfish of me. So I think those are good reasons to have an appendix, but they're completely optional. I can't imagine a case where an appendix would ever be required. If it was required, it should probably be in your main dissertation. For a defense document template, eImpossible does not provide one, and that's simply because I've never seen a university who didn't already have a required template and formatting. So I didn't bother making one, and so at least at my university, University of Texas at El Paso, here's some links of where you would go get these dissertation formatting guides and even a template, and your university should have identical things. This is just one example. So go ahead and get those and then stick with that. I recommend strongly that you download a template and do your writing in that. Don't be lazy and say, I'd like to do my writing and then format it later. That's just lazy words. And trust me, that is going to be a lot less work if you just start immediately typing into the actual template. Learn how to use styles in Microsoft Word or whatever word processing you're using in order to use that template correctly. The defense presentation. The defense presentation really follows the same outline as your dissertation. You're going to introduce your topic, talk about why it's new and novel, summarize your research, and be very blunt here about what your scientific contributions were. Then you'll go into the background and you might talk about the history of your topic a little bit. You might talk about some methods that you developed. You'll get in, you'll summarize your research. You'll talk about the scope and objectives, what you did and what you didn't do. You'll talk about your performance metrics and how you met those, hopefully, your methods, and you're basically just telling the story of your research. Remember to start at a high level and then fill in the details. Hold the audience's hand through all of this. And then you'll conclude. So there's no information here that is not in your dissertation. It may just be you have to be a little clear and blunt about certain things, like what were your scientific contributions. So that needs to be blunt here. Maybe not as blunt in your dissertation document, but it still needs to be there. I do provide, eImpossible provides a template for your defense presentation. And it's very similar to the proposal template if you watch that video, but we're not having to talk about a research plan here because you've already done it. You're just talking about your research. But otherwise, it's similar questions that you're answering. So feel free to use this or make up your own template. But in the highlights here, these are the questions that you need to answer on each slide. Please be very clear and blunt when answering those questions on these slides.